everyone, this is Peak Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be my spoiler review of Mission Impossible The Final Reckoning. Now you can check out my non-spoiler review of the film and all my other reviews of all the other Mission Impossible films within the channel, and I'll leave some links within the description. So this won't be a chronological breakdown, but just more of an outline of the elements which I thought worked well and didn't work quite as well within the movie. So the first part I want to focus on were all of the callbacks and references to previous entries within the franchise, which overall I felt really weren't necessary, especially with a Mission Impossible movie. And this is one of many examples where the film was trying to go for a greatest hits or a victory lap of the franchise, very similar to what we saw in the likes of Avengers Endgame. And right from the jump, at the start of the film, we had the long narration from Angela Bassett's character, as Ethan is assigned the mission to take the entity down. And this is where we were getting all of the clips from the previous films very quickly and fastly edited, especially if you were a new viewer, you wouldn't have had a clue what all of this was about, so you would have been very lost, and this scene especially was too extended. We then had other references and retcons within the franchise, trying to link everything back to this story. We learn that the source code of the entity within the submarine is actually the rabbit's foot device that Ethan retrieved from the third Mission Impossible film. And this was an attempt to try and amp up the motivation, as if Ethan was solely responsible for the existence of the entity in the first place. And again, this didn't really make any sense. I don't know why we had to tie him back to the third film. That was a pretty much complete storyline. We didn't need to go back to the explanation of the rabbit's foot at all, so again, very unnecessary. As was the ridiculous moment where we learn that the CIA agent Jasper Briggs, played by Shea Wigham, was actually the son of Jim Phelps. This was the mentor turned villain from the original first film. The character was played by Jon Voight, and that the whole final reckoning, as it were, in terms of the title, was Jasper looking to gain some sort of completion, I guess, in the arrest of Ethan. But we actually see at the end of the film, he goes on to shake Ethan's hand, as if that was some sort of completion of a redemption arc for Ethan, I guess. But again, this didn't really make any sense, as Jim Phelps was the antagonist for Ethan to take down in a climatic train sequence from the first film. So I don't really understand what they were trying to go for here. There was no guilt needed by Ethan at the end of the day in terms of taking Jasper Dads down. Again, from a new viewer point of view, you would have been completely lost at this connection, so there was no point to it. As was the May 22nd, 1996 date within a letter that President Erica Sloan had asked Ethan to give to the Admiral Neely character, who was played by Hannah Waddingham. Now, the only significance of all of this was that the date was the original release of the first Mission Impossible movie, and that's it. So we then talk of the entity, which, to be honest, was been the weakest element of both of these Reckoning movies. It was initially interesting in part one. We had that kind of sinister overtone, and we were all guessing what exactly was this entity, how was it created, how did it manage to connect to Gabriel, why was it so obsessed with Ethan. But none of those elements were followed through within this film this time around. We see after Ethan and Grace escape Gabriel's capture and they're breaking free, they find the connection chamber, I guess, that we saw Gabriel lying in part one on the train. And this is how he managed to communicate with the entity. Again, they didn't explain how this came to be. But we see Ethan blindly going into the chamber to talk to the entity. And we really get this disorientating sequence where we get close-ups of Ethan's eyes along with the entity as it explains its overall plan to destroy the world. We had, again, all of these flashbacks to seeing the nuclear Armageddon over the world. And this sequence really wasn't ideal if you had any type of epileptic issues, just really flashing all over the place, and yet another example of the film just overdoing it. And it was just never explained as to why the entity couldn't have stopped the IMF team multiple times, despite having control over all of the global networks. It clearly knew what they were trying to do, that they were trying to stop it. So why didn't it disarm any of the uses of the technology that they were using at the time in order to devise their plans? It just never made any sense, and you just wish they had gone for a different choice of an antagonist. We then talk of Dear Luther, the other OG character within the franchise aside from Ethan. Now, Over the trajectory of the franchise, he's kind of faded away after the second and third films, before coming more to prominence from Rogue Nation onwards. And this was perhaps the movie's one big emotional moment, where Luther was already suffering from illness before. We see him captured by Gabriel in a cell alongside a bomb. Ethan then runs frantically, as always, to get to Luther, but when he arrives, he sees that Luther is trapped within the cell and that he can't get out. And Luther eventually sacrifices himself to ensure that the bomb only detonates underground, giving Ethan enough time to escape. Now, was this moment impactful? I would say yes and no. We really didn't get enough time to linger on Luther's death afterwards, which again is very surprising given the movie's very excessive runtime. And perhaps it probably would have carried more weight if we had just had one or two moments to see Ethan crestfallen after his death alongside the team. But this moment really should have been the big emotional catalyst for the motivation for vengeance, to give the film purpose and really drive the team forward in order to both stop the entity and at the same time gain revenge for Luther's death. But this is where things really started to go wrong, because instead of staying close to the team and their mission going forward, we then split Ethan away from them and we get really three protracted scenes, and this was overall a big mistake. Now, the first of these lengthy scenes involved Ethan getting apprehended by the government, and we see him going to the base where we see President Eureka Sloan, who we all know from Mission Impossible Fallout. And we get this heavy exposition once more of going over all of the previous mission movies, as we see the other government officials going over Ethan's previous activities. Again, why we needed this, I'm not so sure. And whilst it's always great to see Angela Bassett anytime on screen, this just wasn't really necessary. Now, yes, you could have had little moments in between showing the government and their overall decisions and how stressed they were at the impending Armageddon over the world, which would have been fine. But having this elongated sequence just didn't do the story any favours. And I also questioned the logic of laying the hopes of the entire world squarely on Ethan's shoulders. Yes, we do know he's saved times in the past, but not to have any contingency as a backup just in case Ethan failed just really wasn't plausible. And for some reason, we then had the lengthy scene where Ethan had to talk to Hannah Waddingham's character, Admiral Neely, another needless detour. And I was asking, what exactly was this adding to the overall story, which was absolutely nothing and just a complete waste of time, and also a complete waste of Hannah Waddingham, who we simply don't see enough in any cinematic movies. We then had the truly stupid moment where Ethan jumps off the naval ship into freezing water with no gear, no oxygen whatsoever. What exactly was he planning to do when he jumped from this ship? He had no backup, the team were already on their way separately to meet him at the later points, so I don't know exactly what he was thinking here. Now, just out of pure luck, the other naval team show up exactly to save him from drowning, from freezing temperatures, but they don't even know who he was, so exactly I don't know why they showed up at this particular point. And then we had the further overlong sequence of Ethan on the submarine, talking to the base captain, running on the treadmill, and then we had this lengthy fight sequence where he was battling this assassin, and this was coupled together with the team coming under attack from the other Russian team. Again, another needless fight sequence that you could have taken completely out of the movie. Now, another aspect that I was disappointed by was the lack of development for Grace, who was very prominent in Dead Reckoning Part 1, at the expense, admittedly, of Ilse Faust. But after she joined IMF, you wanted to see a further progression into her skill set. How would she learn to come to terms with being a full member of the IMF? How would her life change? What other skills would she learn along the way? But this time around, she's just kind of there, with no real big asset to the team. At least Paris was a skilled fighter as well as being able to handle weapons just like Elsa was. But Grace, at the end of the day, is just able to pick pockets. That's it. And she's sidelined in the background, much like the other members of the team, and she just didn't really do much throughout this entire movie, which was a major disappointment given the alluring appeal of Hayley Atwell as always. We then talk about the much hyped submarine sequence as Ethan looks to retrieve the source code data from the Sevastool submarine based in Russia. And yes, this was a very well executed and directed sequence, as was the whole movie in general. We did have plenty of tension and claustrophobia as we see Ethan having to navigate his way through the broken parts of the submarine. You did have to suspend disbelief even more than usual, where we seen Ethan navigating through all of the large missile warheads. And yes, there was a bit of an awe-inspiring nature to seeing all of these destructive weapons within the submarine. And I think this sequence worked very well. It was overlong again. You could have easily cut this sequence in half and it would have had the same effect. But it was all still going along nicely until the moment that Ethan has to let go of all of his submarine gear in order to break out of the submarine. Even to the point where he has to take off his oxygen mask and literally is just wearing his shorts as he's already hundreds of feet deep down in the water, and then we see him being dragged even further down as he's hooked on to the wreckage during this moment. So again, you were just more eye roll in your eyes rather than really getting caught up in all of the excitement. We see Ethan trying to rise to the top in just his shorts, and it was just lucky that Grace was able to meet him at a certain point. So again, whilst it was very well directed, I just think it was one moment of disbelief too many. We then move on to Gabriel, who initially had a lot of potential intrigue as a villain within part one, and that movie started off with the whole personal connection with this woman that was killed. And we were wondering, was this somebody that Gabriel had a huge personal connection to and that Ethan killed her? Because if you remember, that's how he was recruited into the IMF team and to begin with. And was Gabriel on this long running mission for revenge? We also were asking how exactly was Gabriel connected to the entity and why he was chosen to be its emissary in many ways. But the movie didn't do anything with all of those interesting elements. Gabriel is a one-note villain. He enters the fray in the beginning of the movie as he captures Ethan and Grace, which really was a repeat of the same capture sequence that we saw in Rogue Nation. And then after that, Gabriel disappears for half of the film and he comes through at the end as they're trying to negotiate within the underground caverns as we see yet another large nuclear device, and then we see him battling Ethan on the biplane sequence. And this was really just a waste of a villain. And to be fair, we haven't really had a lot of substantial villains throughout the Mission Impossible franchise, the most substantial one being Philip Seymour Hoffman from the third film, and maybe then Henry Cavill later on in Fallout. But again, for two movies, both of which are at least 2.5 hours long, to not even be able to develop a substantial villain was yet again another failure within the entire story. So just a complete waste. And then as we go on to the overall plane sequence, the way that Gabriel goes out laughing, stating that he has the only parachute before flying away and being cut off at the side was just a very unintentional laughing moment. So just a disappointing villain overall. And then we move on to the movie's ending. As I mentioned before, the plane sequence and confrontation between Ethan and Gabriel is again another spectacular moment. I did prefer this sequence to the overall submarine scene. And despite it being yet again a recreation of the helicopter sequence that we saw in Fallout, it was still very well directed and spectacular. I did question how exactly Ethan was able to parachute his way down after we see the first parachute being burned as he falls into descent, and he's frantically trying to connect the source code data to the algorithm in order to trap the entity. And even this moment felt again like a repeat of the Fallout sequence as he's trying to reconnect the device, as we see Benji and Grace frantically trying to disarm the nuclear bomb as well. But Ethan manages to successfully connect the device, which traps the entity and stops all of the nuclear missiles being disarmed. So we save the day once more. And this is when we see Jasper Phelps shaking Ethan's hand at the end. The source code device is destroyed, so the government can't use the entity for any future plans. We then get an extended narration of Luther as Ethan is walking within the fields. And then the team meet up once more and then Grace hands the trapped entity device to Ethan as the only person who can be trusted with it, and then the team just walks away in the street. So a bit of a flat ending really for supposedly the final installment. You'd want something a bit more definitive, a bit more resounding and conclusive. And I do have this sneaky suspicion that this may not be the final installment of the franchise. They've kind of left the door a bit open to have another mission. Again, that will depend on how the movie performs in terms of the overall box office. So that's it really in my overall in-depth spoiler review of Mission Impossible The Final Reckoning. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you have any other further suggestions regarding any other movies, television series, or any other topics within the pop entertainment and culture scene that you'd like to see me cover within the channel, then also let me know within the comments, and I'll see if I can provide further commentary for you on the subject matter within the future. Please also hit like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you very, very soon.